This is the story of George Stinney. He was just 14 years old.
For thy goodness sake, O Lord.
When he was taken by the authorities and charged with a crime.
This will only last a moment.
But they didn't just convict him, they executed him.
O my God, do I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed. Let not mine enemies triumph over me.
And just yesterday, he was exonerated. Finally, the state of South Carolina said he didn't do it.
When you land, you be ahead and think about it like you're leaping over a wide ditch.
The story of George Stinney begins in Alcolu, South Carolina in 1944. Stinney, along with his parents, George Stinney Sr. and Aimee, and his 4 siblings, lived in housing provided by the local sawmill where his father worked. During this era of segregation in America, Stinney's family faced not only economic struggles, but also discrimination due to their African American heritage. A small-town mystery. The corpses of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames were discovered on March 23, 1944, in a ditch located on the African American side of Alcolu. The girls had not returned home the previous night after they were last seen riding their bikes in search of flowers. They had questioned George Stinney and his sister Aimee about the location of the flowers as they passed by the Stinney's property. Although George and Aimee were together at the time of the slayings, the police ignored this vital piece of information in their attempt to find a suspect. George and his older brother John were taken into custody under suspicion, but John was eventually released. However, George remained in custody and was not permitted to see his parents until after his conviction. The Stinney family had to leave their company housing and feared for their safety after George's father was fired from his job at a local sawmill. George had no support during his 81-day confinement and trial, and he was held in a jail in Columbia, 15 miles from Alcolu, because of the possibility of lynching. He was questioned without an attorney or his parents present, which may seem implausible in modern-day America, but was not uncommon in those times. Although America had made significant progress since then, it has not completely emerged from its troubled past.
It doesn't exonerate George Stinney, and history will have to record that he was accused of the murder.
The original trial happened so long ago, a full-blown redo is not going to happen.
But I think there is plenty of record to demonstrate, but a grant of a new trial simply announces that this was not a fair process.
Well, he said in the letters, this thing that he accusing me of, I am not guilty.
A horrible end. On April 24, 1944, the trial against Stinney took place, including jury selection. Stinney's court-appointed attorney, Charles Plowden, was campaigning for local office as a tax commissioner at the time. Despite there being no signed confession, Plowden did not challenge the 3 police officers who testified that Stinney had confessed to the slayings. He also failed to challenge the prosecution at any point. During the trial, Stinney's counsel did not call any witnesses, cross-examine witnesses, or provide any significant defense for Stinney. Between his arrest and execution, Stinney's parents were only allowed to see him once, after the trial, when he was held at the Columbia Penitentiary. Due to the threat of lynching, they were not permitted to see him again. Stinney was fatally punished at 7:30 a.m. on June 16, 1944, through the use of the electric chair, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Crowley.
And he came up to us and he wanted to know what were we doing down there. We lived right back close to Green Hill Baptist Church. Just that they were very sweet girls. March, I was 8 in May, but I firmly believe that he did because of the way he threatened us.
Miscarriage of justice. In 2004, local historian George Frierson started researching the case after reading a newspaper article which gained the attention of South Carolina lawyers Steve McKenzie and Matt Burgess. Other attorneys, including Ray Brown and James Moon, also contributed to researching and reviewing historical documents, finding witnesses and evidence to help exonerate Stinney. On October 25, 2013, McKenzie, Burgess, and Chandler filed a motion for a new trial. New evidence was presented in a January 2014 court hearing, including testimony from Stinney's siblings An affidavit from the Reverend Francis Batson and testimony from a fellow prisoner who claimed Stinney was forced to confess. Rather than granting a new trial, on December 16, 2014, Judge Carmen Mullen vacated Stinney's conviction, citing that he did not receive a fair trial and his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated. She ruled that Stinney's confession was likely coerced and therefore inadmissible. She also found that fatally punishing a 14-year-old was cruel and unusual punishment, and that his attorney failed to call exculpating witnesses or to preserve his right of appeal. However, Judge Mullen did not absolve Stinney of guilt, stating that he may have committed the crime. The legal proceedings and trial were fraught with errors and oversights, leading to a grave miscarriage of justice, and Stinney paid for it with his life.
Ruth's sister, Violet Freeman, went home with me from school. So we went down to the church to get some water, pushing a tricycle to take back to the house. This black boy came down there. He said, well, if you don't get away from here, and if you come back, I will kill you. Went missing the next day. I said, we came to get some water, and we just got to playing down here. That was the evening before the girl and Tim's girl.
The real culprit. George Burke Jr. is now considered by some modern researchers as a possible culprit for the slayings. He belonged to a well-known white family and was a likely suspect, according to the family, who claimed that he made a last confession. Some members of the family also served on the initial coroner's inquest jury that recommended Stinney's prosecution. Burke Jr. passed away in 1947 at the age of 26. His father, Burke Sr., conducted an initial search for the girls and owned the land where the bodies were found. He was also the foreman of the grand jury that indicted Stinney and had been accused of shifting the blame from his son onto Stinney. According to a resident of Alcolu, George Burke Jr.'s son, Wayne Burke, once said that his grandmother told him that his father had picked up the girls in his lumber truck by her house on the day of their slaying. However, Wayne Burke denied making that statement in 2017 and remained convinced of Stinney's guilt. Stinney's sister had previously mentioned, according to rumors and testimonies, Burke Jr. was known to be violent and had a history of physical misconduct. He was also allegedly seen washing his clothes in a nearby swamp shortly after the slayings, and his family had connections to the local law enforcement and judicial system. Several sources have claimed that Burke Jr.'s family used their influence to steer the blame away from him and onto Stinney, who was a young black boy with no connections or resources to defend himself. Burke Sr. was the foreman of the grand jury that indicted Stinney, and some have accused him of manipulating the evidence and testimony to secure a conviction. Despite the mounting evidence against Burke Jr., he was never formally charged or tried for the slayings. He passed away in 1947, 3 years after the crime, at the age of 26.
And they're hoping that a South Carolina judge will soon issue a symbolic verdict.
Now, clearly there can't be a new trial, but a grant of a new trial simply announces that this was not a fair process.
Even though George Stinney's trial was 70 years ago, legal advocates today have still not given up on his cause.
It doesn't exonerate George Stinney, and history will have to record that he was accused of the murder.
Let sleeping dogs lie? The saying, "let sleeping dogs lie," suggests leaving things alone. But when a grave injustice such as that suffered by George Stinney is committed, it is important for society and the state to thoroughly investigate and rectify the situation. Although Stinney perished at the young age of 14, the injustice done to him has left a lasting legacy that demands reparations. In January 2022, a bill was introduced by South Carolina State Representative Cesar McKnight, named after Stinney and called the George Stinney Fund. George's family members and various civil rights advocates have sought to clear his name of the slayings. In January 2014, a judge held a 2-day hearing, which included testimony from 3 of George's surviving siblings, members of the search party, and several experts. The state argued at the hearing that George's conviction should stand. In vacating the conviction that George found, that George Stinney was fundamentally deprived of due process throughout the proceedings against him, that the alleged confession simply cannot be said to be known and voluntary, that the court-appointed attorney did little to nothing to defend George, and that his representation was the essence of being ineffective. The judge concluded, "I can think of no greater injustice." Stinney was exonerated 70 years after he became the youngest person fatally punished in the U.S. in the 1900s. The decision to vacate Stinney's conviction was celebrated by many as a long overdue step towards justice, but it also highlighted the many injustices faced by Black Americans in the Jim Crow South and the ongoing struggle for racial equality in the United States.
Years ago, their families realized that this particular day I went to the beauty parlor with my brother Charles. They knew about it and didn't say anything about it. They just let it slide. And my sister Amy stayed home with George. George had been taken away. Some men came in the car and took him away.
A life taken. How was it possible for a child to be convicted, sentenced, and punished based on circumstantial evidence in a trial that lasted only a few hours, even in the Jim Crow South? Eli Faber's The Child in the Electric Chair answers this question through extensive archival research and interviews with Stinney's contemporaries. Faber offers a compelling narrative with a meticulous research analysis of the world in which Stinney lived, the era of lynching, segregation, and racist assumptions about Black Americans. By placing the Stinney case into a larger context, Faber reveals how this case is not just a travesty of justice locked in the era of the Jim Crow South, but rather one that continues to resonate in our own time. As society grapples with the legacies of racial injustice, Stinney's story remains relevant. The author asserts that even though Stinney's passing happened in the past, it is still very much a part of the present. The Child in the Electric Chair is a book that everyone should read to understand how the injustice of one person can have far-reaching effects on society. Through his book, we learn about the tragedies of racial injustice and how it can shape the lives of individuals and communities. The story of George Stinney is a painful reminder of how systemic racism and personal agendas can deny individuals their basic rights and ultimately result in grave injustices. That's all for today, folks. See you in the next one.